Hey, everybody. Before I start this episode, I want you to know I got a new microphone. I had the gain blasted all the way up. So it's very boomy and loud. And be warned, but now it's fixed. In today's episode, I speak with Lorcan and Helen about re-indigenizing as Irish peoples. Welcome to the Holistic Life Navigation Podcast, where we explore life through the lens of somatics. I'm Luis Mujica, a somatic educator who teaches people how to find safety in themselves. Your turn to learn begins now. Okay, I'm here with Lorcan and Helen. So happy to be here with you too. Y'all remember Lorcan? He came on a while back. Wait, what did you just say? 2 years?
It must be that, eh?
Yeah,
But I can't
think it
quite
was.
remember. But it was crazy time. Like it was still COVID time and all that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. We were supposed to speak this summer, and something happened on either my end or your end. But I remember I was swimming. There's a creek outside, and I was in the cold creek, and I was thinking of you. And now Helen, after what you wrote to me, and I was just letting the water, dance all over me. And I was thinking, oh, this is perfect. I'll have the water on me when I speak to Lorcan. And I ran in last minute, totally undressed, and like got on Zoom and was waiting for you. But then again, something happened. But whenever I go in the water, I think of you and my friends that love the water so much.
Well, that connects us so well. And Helen is the water baby, really. I'm a wuss. I have to get out much quicker than Helen does.
Yeah. I don't even know where to begin. I know that one of my intentions is just I love hearing people's individual experiences of what my friend Asha Frost calls re-indigenizing. And she speaks of it as a Native woman in what we call Canada now. And I think she's Ojibwe. And she essentially works with all people to reconnect to their Indigenous heritage and their ancestors, regardless of where they're from. I love that term re-indigenizing because I always use decolonizing, but re-indigenizing is like the how. It's like the action of actually re-invoking the ancestors and the land. And so it's so fun for me to speak to people who share my ancestry. Like I'm German, Irish, and Puerto Rican. So I love to learn more from my Irish family. So I wanted you two to come on and kind of teach me and those of us listening who are Irish and who aren't, just more about your experiences, your practices, how you have re-indigenized, how you're working toward more of that in your land where you live. Who wants to begin? Where do we start? I was lit up by what you wrote to me this morning about Helen already, about the Mer people. That was so amazing. So, should we start there? You tell me. I'm too excited to decide.
Well, what do you think? Or do you want to start?
Well, no, there's loads of places to begin for sure. And like you probably remember when we were elaborating the previous conversation, I was talking about a tri-spiral, like 3 spirals. We call it a triscally here in Ireland. It's 3 spirals kind of held together. And it's formed the basis of a lot of our thinking and our models, our training models. So if you're going around in circles, it's not a problem. It's a good thing. So we keep touching on the same points again and again and again. But coming around to that notion of re-indigenizing and how to conceptualize it and to express it, because it's not without controversy. I think we mentioned this the last time about people seeing white folk, I suppose, trying to reclaim some sort of heritage when they've done bad things in the past, particularly, the Irish nation or the Irish people within this island and the amount of conflict goes on. But if you're speaking in one language, you're kind of bound by the terms of that language to a certain extent, by the conceptual straitjacket and avenues that it brings you. So I suppose one of our key things around re-indigenizing is learning our own language again, the language that was taken off us, that we were not allowed to learn at one stage and has been controversial in our political and social history for the last, number of years, about whether you learn it or you don't learn it and what it means, the label it puts on you. But fundamentally, I suppose it is inherently political, but it's really about meaning, attributing meaning to what we experience and what goes on in the world has to be held in our own hands. It can't be held in somebody else's hands. And for us as people, we need the terms that allow us into the concepts and the ways of thinking that our ancestors have thought and lived by. So it has to be the language that they used inherently, because when we come back to the word in Irish for indigenous is duchas, duchasa. I think that might have been one of our endpoints when we were talking the last time. We were moving from this idea of duchas, which means being, identity, and belonging in nature.
Mm.
So it's a broad term for that sense of home and appropriate home in your surroundings culturally and naturally. And duchasa is the activization of that. So it's a nice word because it expresses the idea of indigenizing actively without you feeling that you have to redo it. It's not a new thing. It's just something that you're doing now when you begin to practice.
Yeah, and that sort of links into the story of Liban, which is this story of this mermaid that it's kind of been locked away in old Irish language. It's been recorded for hundreds of years, but people hadn't been interpreted. So this woman went back to the original records and translated the old Irish to bring the story, make it accessible for us. And then I suppose how that journey started was really like a very embodied process of then taking the story, and Lorcan and a small group of us then just we did a little paddleboarding trip of trying to map out the place where she was created in this place called Loch Ness. It's their biggest lake in Ireland. And so that's where she kind of transformed from being a human to half salmon, with a salmon's tail and half human. So really the start of that process was really lovely. It was just getting on the water and in some ways trying to empathize with her journey from Loch Ness down the River Bann out to the sea. So that was this early stages of that process. And since then, it's really just unfolded more and more and more, and more people have got involved in a sort of collective way, especially women, because what's lovely about this myth is that, it really brings alive the kind of the realities of, ownership of women's bodies and extractivism and all this, the kind of colonial story, but also then can flip that on its head. And I think, as you rightly said, that re-indigenizing is how can the story be an empowering story for us in terms of being nature and being in nature, and that really empathizing beyond the human level, with other beings. So that's kind of where it's growing, but it's become a very co-creative process now that's taken a life of its own. So, and I know for myself personally, the story's been it almost intertwines with your own life in some ways, or kind of folds back and forward, which is gorgeous. But it really points to the importance of those stories and the myths of this place. Because the song we sing is not our own all the time, or the stories we tell are not our own. So
yeah,
lovely to reclaim a story that's born of this place. That's it's connected to the ecosystem and water and the life-giving properties of water. So yeah, it's quite exciting. So
I have to ask you about that on a personal level, for you, because I love this idea as a woman of you having this physical, empathic journey of what this Mer woman, experienced. And I'm wondering, what did it invoke for you? What did you feel in your body? What became alive through that practice or that journey? What did you learn about yourself?
But one of the things that always resonated with me with the story, and with some of the other women as well, is that how do you live then with the tail? How do you become a water-based mammal when we're normally biped and land-based? So that process of kind of almost playing what that's like in the water, and not in different conditions, we had a group of women. We all went into the sea one day. It was like the stormiest day that I've ever seen. There was waterfalls that were going up instead of down.
Wow.
and this group of women, we were, I suppose, embodying that process of, feeling what it is like, and the real push and pull of like, you know, of the water and the sea and the wind. And I think, you know, personally, I find that, you know, you feel like it really humbles you because you feel like you're in the elements, you're part of the elements. It puts you back in your place, but not in a disempowering way, if that makes sense. So feeling like the strength of the elements, but then also really starting to appreciate the strength of your body and how it adapts and attunes within that. So I know the tail, for me, Liban's tail always stood out to me because it's a salmon tail. It's really powerful. Like salmon have to make their way upstream and, you know, to go and lay their eggs. So, you know, there's a real feature of strength and beauty and iridescence that's there that kind of also brings back to your bodies and women's bodies that are, I suppose, you know, over the years, women have sometimes a difficult relationship with their bodies. And I think for me, the whole process, the Triskel process, but also the story of Liban was like a real sense of appreciation for the body and a deep sense of gratitude for what it does for me on a daily basis and appreciating its strengths rather than its weaknesses. So that's kind of one example that, and just noticing what lives under the sea. You know, I think that it's a magical part of our world it's very hidden and almost invisible. And like more recently, we've been spending more time just noticing what's in there and, you know, trying to communicate and interact with all the amazing features of seaweed, you know, and little creatures that are just so beautiful and magical in their own way. So there's a part of that journey is just going back under and appreciating that too. And I think essentially for me, the story of Liban is a story of liberation. It's a story of cutting yourself free from the various nets that hold us or catch us along the way. So being able to kind of bring that in a conscious way to our lives and think, you know, when we get caught, you know, noticing when we're caught is usually the first step, but then being able to actively do something about it.
Yeah, I think it's what I love about the re-indigenizing experience for myself and anyone I know that goes through it is you're cutting yourself out of that colonial net that has all these constructs, you know, like race and sex and gender and class, like all those things that were born from colonization. We just get to go back to this really beautiful expression of land and relationship to land itself. And when I think about the mermaid and I think about I love like the visual of the salmon tail, you know, I just see this beautiful, like rainbowy kind of pink, you know, fluttering muscle, just propelling the body through water. It's really this story of not othering parts of nature or ourselves as well. Because I hear, like I went snorkeling in Puerto Rico earlier this year. And when I was in this kind of bay that was right next to the wild ocean, I just really felt like I was being tossed in the womb of the earth herself. Like it was so fertile. And it was just like you're saying, noticing there's this whole other world and life and realm an inch under the water that if I have a fear or a disconnect from, I miss out on all those relationships that can occur. So as you're talking about this, I'm just feeling it in my own body of these myths being a way in as to how do we invoke these other elements? How do we invoke the other than human, you know, aspects of ourselves and of the land? Is that kind of where you're at with it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just, you know, it's absolutely invoking it and in some ways, I think the opportunity is to help people overcome those barriers of why the fear, you know, and I think that's maybe where the story can help bring people gently into those spaces and maybe think, look, here's, you know, whole world that, you know, you don't need to be afraid of. That's kind of it's all there waiting. And it's, yeah, so I think that's the potential. And I think also there's a potential for that myth to be a really good story, you know, about a strong woman and, you know, doesn't have to, you know, a lot of our Irish myths, as you know, are like battle led by, the Finn McCools and the Cahullans. And it's not to say they're not important, but it's kind of, there is a real gap or imbalance between the myths that are kind of more empowering in terms of the role of woman as well.
Mm-hmm.
But something was lovely in that process. One of the things that came out with that group of women on that day was that, because Lorcan actually was there for just the swimming part in terms of behind the scenes, like a safety kind of role, because it was a crazy day. Like nobody in their right minds would have been in the sea.
Yeah.
But what came out for a lot of the women that were in that process was that there was a really, it's kind of like where the divine masculine really felt important, and there was so sometimes the Khazar myth for me was, I couldn't figure out the role of men in it. I was really questioning about, well, what does this say about men and the role of men? So I think it's still important that that's not ignored, or because it all requires balance, and I think that was something that the other women in the group brought up on that day, that for them that was an important experience. So I think it's it's important to acknowledge that as well.
I love that you said that, because someone was just talking to me the other day about the animus, and they were saying about they just wrote to me yesterday saying they were swimming in the water in the Caribbean, just kind of floating there, and they were thinking about the animus of the ocean. And I haven't studied Jung very deeply, but his whole idea of the animus is this masculine feature of feminine, like what lives under the feminine. So when you're saying about the divine masculine and that role, right? Like, I guess I'll turn this to Lorcan. What did that feel like for you? Like, how do you experience the divine masculine? How do you experience the feminine and masculine through your body when you're in the water, when you're with Earth?
A really good question. Like, I'm going to do a Margaret Thatcher on you and answer my own question, but yeah, I wanted to just jump on there in terms of our origins as a species. We originated in the water. So when we talk about our ancestors, and this is not another really important touch point for us when we're re-indigenizing, that we've got the kind of meaning bit about how we illustrate and provide meaning to our lives. We were talking about language earlier, and then we have the embodiment and nature bit, and rebalancing our relationship with nature. But then we've got our ancestral connection, and we tend to default to an ancestral connection which is inherently human, when in fact it's not. That's not the whole story, that we crawled out of the water. So what Helen brings with great benefit to some of the discussions that we have is our work around trauma, and the reptilian brain being such a key feature of our decision making in everyday life. So even just the name reptilian brain, like we were in the water, our ancestors were in the water, we were comfortable in the water, we survived in the water. All those kind of concepts are really, really important. I suppose when it comes around to the whole dichotomy between male and female, that's a different...
Wait, let's pause, because what you said was so good. I wanted to sit with that for a moment, because I've been on this real ride with trauma lately, because that's really what I practice in this world is teaching and moving through it and feeling it in my own body and such. And I've been really feeling trauma as part of the divine, not as this thing that is like horrible, right? Which is strange to hear. Some people think it's like the worst thing that could happen is having trauma. I come from trauma from the place of, it's not the event, it's the body's response to the event. It's the energy left in your body from the event. So I'm not saying like the abuse is beautiful. I'm saying this electricity that runs through your body is as ancient as the earth itself. And when you're talking about it, you said it in this way just now that kind of lit that up for me, the reptilian brain. You were saying how we crawled out of the water. And what I was hearing was all these transformations we've gone through as a species, right? From this like reptile coming out of the water, this cell, whatever, that divided into these bodies, and how the trauma is this kind of ancient gift that saves us. It's this way that our own nature inside of us responds to threat so we can actually survive a situation. And I've been really interested in revering trauma through an animist lens of a being that's inside of me, just like any god or goddess or deity that deserves like respect and honor and relationship with, just the way we would relate to the thunder or the lightning or the rain. I'm curious where that sits for you two, what that's like. when I say that.
Well, very briefly, I would kind of relate it to the idea that we're too hyper individualized. It's great in that we can all express, unique features of our experience, and we can write books and poetry and all the rest. It is all very different. But in effect, if you think of yourself as a blade of grass in the field, which really comes back to Indigenous thinking as well, you're not really that different from anybody else. And when you're bending over in the wind, under the force of the wind, the blade of grass next to you isn't doing anything much different than you are, even though it might have a slightly different orientation or whatever. So when you come around to something like breath work, which I know is key to trauma work as well and healing work, like I've been thinking much more of like the idea of being breathed as opposed to breathing.
Absolutely.
So you're kind of putting out this notion, like take the hyper individual out of it and become so much more part of the collective. And what is nature trying to get you to do, as opposed to what are you affecting on nature? And that is a bit of a flip point. And I think particularly when you come into water, because it's so much more, osmotic.
Absolutely.
Like is the water breathing the fish? Is the fish breathing the water? What kind of chemical and biological process is going on there? So it kind of brings you out of this kind of idea of like, it's not as important what I do. It's actually more important what is happening to me and understanding and appreciating that. So it relates, I suppose, to what you're saying about trauma and that it being a feature of nature and a feature of life. And yeah, some of the fundamental texts, Helen will be far better on them than me, kind of relate about the, the instinctual responses that come up from threat.
Yeah. And I think there's something about, I always find like the nervous system really exciting because it's, again, we know it's not, our nervous systems are interacting with lots of things all at the one time. So it's not like as much as our nervous system has been kind of influenced by our ancestors and our lives, it's constantly in communication with everything. And I think that's the kind of, I think that's kind of where the coming back into our senses, coming back to our senses, it's almost like honoring the reptilian brain because of all the sensory data that it's given us, the raw data. And then it's through then understanding how our other parts of our nervous system and brain process it and add meaning and help to understand it. But I think in some ways the practice is almost like going back to the real raw sensory material without trying to influence it too much. And so that's kind of the practice really of Dukasa. It's really much, it's that attunement, isn't it? In the place where you are with the elements, that we're not separate. And I think for healing, that's kind of also how our nervous systems heal each other. If I can bring a to this room today, if I can bring a nervous system that's kind of, attuned and grounded, then that's really good for us all and vice versa. So just, and good, I suppose, taking that beyond the human, thinking about then the kind of nervous systems of our ecosystems.
Absolutely.
And what they're trying to communicate and vice versa, that relational aspect and how we heal each other,
I love that you're saying the word relationship a lot because as you're speaking, I heard this thought in my mind that said, I think I'm going to start calling the nervous system the relationship system, because that's really what it is. It's like, that's our social engagement. That's what helps us feel if there's threat. That's what helps us feel the sensation of love and excitement and even feeling of the person's body. Person also meaning tree or water. So when you're talking about this ecological nervous system of the land, even how mycelium stretch across, just like our nervous systems do, right? Our nerves. It's really this constant, as I experience it, invitation to relate. There's a endless invitation to relate. And I believe one reason we're so traumatized, I'll speak as an American, collectively in America, there's so much trauma is because colonization removes animism. And so instead of having a relationship to other than humans as well as humans, the only thing we can relate to, we think, are other people and their validation and status. And it literally divorces us from the natural world, which again, through a somatic lens means all of the resourcing of relationships we have, from the wind to the leaves to the sounds of the water, are gone. They're not actually gone, but we're not attuning to them because we haven't developed that as a practice. So and this is a question you can each answer individually, but what were your lives like growing up? Were you born into families that practiced this way, or did you have to find this? When did you find it? What was it like for you to reconnect and attune to those all the relationships around you? What was that like?
Yeah, well, I can start if you like.
Yeah, please.
And I certainly grew up in what would be seen as a very traditional kind of background, and and schooling, and definitely was not a practice in my childhood. Although I was lucky in that I had a lot of freedom, because so you went out in the morning, you came back at night, and in between you were usually seeking out the apple trees and the green spaces, and I think I probably have led a life that's been quite disembodied in some ways, until I always had an interest in water. So I've always been in the water. But I suppose the starting point really in terms of cleaning my lens and being able to see some of this was actually doing the trust skill process with Lorcan about 8 years ago, a long time ago.
How did that start? What was that like? How'd you find that even?
I found it really challenging, and I found that I wanted to fall out with them a bit. Because for me, even the colonial story was a new story, because I actually grew up in Ireland with a British identity, Protestant Unionist loyalist, whatever term was the sort of community background. So this colonial story was actually not a story that we were ever educated about, even within our own context of what happened in the Troubles and our own conflict. So I had a lot of unlearning to do, which is hard, because the unlearning's harder than the learning, because you resist it.
That's right.
You like to blame other people for it. So I think I found it hard, but also really the process itself was very immersive, and took a long time. It probably took a year, that first stage.
Walk us through that. Like, what was the first moment that you got it in your body? What was the first moment you didn't just understand it, but you felt, oh, this is what this is about?
Well, it's interesting because, one of the tools is like biomimicry. So, picking an element that you're attracted to or you're drawn to. And the element that I picked was a little leaf that was just fallen off a tree into the river. And it's a river that's not very far from here that I'm very close to. But and so in starting to try and understand the journey for that leaf, or what was happening, and starting to even play about with what's happening to that leaf when it goes into the river and it goes on this journey, and and it gets stuck behind rocks, and all the kind of trying to tell that story of the leaf was probably the first time I'm starting to really even dig up some of those fears around death, some of those fears around, those kind of human fears of wanting to be almost in control, So really, that was a story of really wake up to the idea that a lot of this is just, beyond our control. And
love that.
Being honest about death, being honest and starting to sort of see it as a cycle. And it sounds obvious now, but at the time it was quite profound, I think. So that was the start, but there were so many unfoldings from then outwards. But
see, what you just said to me was very important, because that's what I've been learning from this reverence of trauma as a being again, instead of this like horrible thing that I want to get rid of. It's that practice. I don't even know if it's a practice, but it's that realization, that embodiment of humility, of like, I'm not more important than anything here. Like, I am just as equal as the rock, as the bird, as this other human. And my death and my life is also just as equal. Like, there's this interesting equality that happens when you become, for me, more animist, more land-based, re-indigenizing, because you know how important everything is in that common relationship of life and death. And I'm just saying that because I find my whole life has changed as it grew from that the understanding, like you said, getting real about death. When you start relating with death, it's not, again, this horrible, scary creature. It's this like gorgeous, benevolent life force that's really no different than life. You know, you start feeling that in a different way. So that was a big one for me. And I'm just want to check in with Lorcan. Like, what are you feeling as we talk about this? Like, what was your background like? How did you get into this practice?
Well, I'll talk a wee bit about my father, because he was probably a really important force in getting us outdoors. I had two siblings, and we spent a lot of time, a bit like Helen's family, like you were just kind of ignored during the day, and you went out and did your thing, but really you were picking up all the tools of the trade of how to climb, how to jump, how to relate, how to be physical, social dynamics and all the rest. But he had a bit of a fitness thing going on in his own life, not within the confines of team sport, although we did play football, but kind of getting out into the wilds. And he dragged us kind of through mountainscapes when we were quite young. And at the time we all hated it, but it really changed my life completely. And my relationship with him kind of never really got to the place that I wanted it to be. And when the Indigenous stuff started happening for me, and I was trying to really pull him into line where I think he needed to be, you know, I was talking about, you know, death and moving on. And I remember very vividly, we were sitting in my van overlooking the sea beside where he lived, eating chips. And we just had a kind of argument. And he just said to me, "What makes you think I'm going to die before you die?" Which I kind of felt at the time was kind of breaking an unwritten code between parents and children about, you know, going, "Well, I'm going to go first." You know?
That's right.
You know, it just turned the whole thing on its head. And, you know, it really annoyed me at the time that he would question that. But I suppose he was responding much more so as another living entity rather than as a parent. He was kind of refusing the role of a parent. So he passed away in May there, Lewis. So we had to kind of bring him through the process of moving from one life to the next, me and my sister particularly. And I don't think I would have been able to really, I think I would have found it a traumatic experience if I had stayed in the relationship that I was in with him and I didn't have the Indigenous learning to draw on.
What particular practices, what did you draw on that made that not a traumatic experience?
Well, two things in particular. One was following the feminine, which was my sister's lead. She was able to be completely unquestionably comforting to him through his death process. And I wouldn't have been able to negotiate that very well as a man on my own. I think I would have found it very hard around intimacy and care. So I kind of was just operating in her shadow and kind of backing her up, supporting her logistically, but being there emotionally outside of judgment. But it seemed that when he did pass away, we both, and I knew, whereas before I think I would have been locked very much in a sterile pattern of kind of like being in an anteroom of feeling, not being in my feeling, where I was very much in my feeling. And also I was able to spiritually kind of clear the space, you know, so I knew exactly what to do in terms of allowing his spirit to leave. And I don't even know where that came from. I just moved into a space of, right, here's what we need to do here. We need to do this, do that, do the other. And it felt that, and I suppose that moved into being able to talk about him at his funeral in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do before. So understand the fullness of character, you know, rather than seeing myself as a son and in opposition or in challenge to the father. So I suppose all that learning kind of allowed me to kind of come out of role that way, and
that's
kind
so
of
nice.
Be much more in relationship biologically as opposed to relationship socially.
See, right there, to me, that's the decolonization. Like being in relationship biologically instead of socially. And we're hearing this myth of Liban coming through this story as well, because of like what role is the one that you think you are, this one facet of us that's actually quite confining, but there's so many dimensions inside. So if you stepped out of son for a moment, you also step out of all those expectations of what father should be. And then there's just this really unconditional connection. There's no expectation of someone to be or do something. That's just really gorgeous. It's very moving. I love that. I think that's why I love myth so much. Like when I think of the mermaid, and our little black cat is named Selkie, so I'm always thinking about Selkies. And I'm just, the myth is just, to me, it's this constant reminder that we're more than human. And it's not the only piece in us. I shouldn't even say that. It's like human is just a word. And this goes back to what you were saying with Indigenous language. It's this idea that has all these constructs attached to it socially. But human is so beyond these social constructs. What's your word for human or people? Like what? Tell me what that's like in the Indigenous language.
In Irish, so it'll be dinja for a person, or dini for a group of people. There's probably a load of other terms for it as well. You would have muncher as well. So there's kind of, I suppose Irish has gone through various iterations, early, middle, and modern Irish. So you'll get different words being deposited. And you have words for collections of people like Cayley and Mel, so meetings of people. So I suppose it's probably more collective than individual, isn't it?
And there's different ways of counting people. So the numbers, like in Irish, when you're counting from 1 to 10, if you're counting people, it's different numbers. Isn't it?
Different numbers. And
oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, I know. It's
completely different set of terms. Yeah.
That's more collective, yeah, for sure.
How does the celebration? What do you call it? Like we would call it the Wheel of the Year. What are your Sabbats that you celebrate? Like
well, that's
what do you call
one
those?
thing we've been doing, kind of the nodes of the calendar year. Like people would call them the Celtic calendar here. Well, that is 100% accurate or not, I'm not too sure, because there's people use Celtic as a bit of a funny term. I mean Irish, and it really doesn't, because it was Indo-European really, but there's certainly influence of and pretty much a Bronze Age kind of phenomenon. But anyway,
so would Irish in your experience, would that really pertain to the Indigenous experience of Ireland? Just the word Irish, like what would you call it? Because a lot of people over here do call it Celtic. They say I'm connecting my Celtic heritage, and they mean Indigenous Irish. what would you call it?
That's like Marvel comics, you know what I mean?
Good to know. So it would just be Irish?
Well, yeah, we kind of defaulted to saying the island of Ireland, isn't it? If you're on the island, but then you would almost have to include the waterways and the seas as well, because Irish then can become, well, politicized, but kind of pigeonholed. Are you Irish or Northern Irish? Are you, I mean, what way you identify politically or socially? So I suppose if you're an inhabitant of this island or the seas and the waters that are part of it, you're part of our community, part of our sister and brotherhood. The nodes, going back to that, would be Samhain, Halloween, then Imbolc for the start of spring, then Beltane, which is the start of summer, the fire festival, and then Lunasa, which is kind of the harvest time. So that's where we place our kind of workshops that we've been doing for the last year or so. So quarterly, we kind of gather together with a group of like-minded people and interested people and begin to celebrate the significance of those nodes. So we're coming into Samhain, which is really the end of our year, and it's a time when the two worlds, the spirit and the human world, kind of cross over. So we'll kind of frame our celebrations and our gatherings around those themes, in a sense, because they all provide a different cyclical, within the cycle of life and the cycle of the sun and the moon and the tides. We kind of hook in there, don't we?
Yeah, it's kind of like going back to the source of each of those moments or those kind of key points, and I think because some of the practices, it's interesting about what do you do and where do you draw your information from, and and I think part of it's like a co-creative process where we're kind of working together, but also trying to draw as closely to the source of the elements or the old stories or whatever we can, but yeah, that makes sense.
It does. And when I always love, so you call them the nodes. That's so beautiful. I never heard that before. So does that mean you don't celebrate the solstices? Because we do both over here. We do this, we call them the Sabbats, like Beltane, and then we'd have summer solstice.
Yeah, I suppose we celebrate them, but that's not where when we gather.
Got it.
Although I suppose the interesting thing is that, as Helen was referring to, it's a wee bit of a self-discovery and community discovery exercise. So we recognize much more so than we would have done even 2 or 3 years ago, Lewis, that there's a whole community of people working on these themes in Ireland, and we're only one small group, but there's a whole range of people. So, they would be celebrating the equinox solstices, and we're really trying to correspond and connect with those groups. Now we have a conference that we're trying to run in Belton the next year, the 1st of May. So to try and particularly draw those groups in together to have that common conversation, because many of the questions that come up are very kind of communal questions, but also conflictual. So we need to have those kind of debates that challenge each other around what it is to be Indigenous in this land.
Yeah.
You just get too cozy, and you'll get a wee bit lazy and easy thinking. But I mean, if you're not challenged all the time, or if you don't have to answer questions on it, you know what I mean? So there's definitely a larger way of breaking than ours. We're a small ripple in the whole thing. Happening all around this land and in other countries I know as well. But Ireland has definitely got a unique character to its Indigenous nature that is really about successive invasion, influenced then by successive migrations and what those people. So when you go back to the Celtic stuff, that was a phase of invasion, but really, I suppose, like a way of breaking what's left after the breaking, after the invasion and the wiping out. What's left? What remains? And like Helen's got a lovely term that she came up with called warriors in waiting, and it kind of refers to the species that we observe in our landscape that kind of wait for the trauma to pass to re-emerge.
I love that.
When we are gone, they will re-emerge.
And that's what we would look at that as a freeze response, like in trauma language. And a lot of people shame the freeze response because it doesn't seem as it seems to lack agency, unlike fighting or flighting or screaming. But freeze is so sophisticated and intelligent. So I love this in waiting. It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Like you're waiting for the environment to shift for your survival, and then you emerge. And that's a beautiful term for that. I want to go back for a minute though. We only have a couple minutes.
Yeah.
When I think of these nodes, I'm going back to Helen's term earlier of the ecological nervous system. Do you experience the way I experience when I look outside right now, and we're getting close to Samhain, and I see the leaves falling. So like literally the veil is thinning, in the forest as I look. That reflects something in me. This isn't just about me as an observer of the changing earth. It's like the earth is showing me something's also changing in me, and there's something to listen to. And I see the celebration as these nodes as, oh, my internal is being externalized in the earth. Now I'm going to listen and then merge. What's that like for you in your bodies?
I think it's really important, and I think that's why our seasons here are still quite defined. We're kind of and that bodily way of knowing I always find really hard to talk about, but there is that kind of that kind of wisdom that comes from the body. And as you say, it's because the body is nature, and with the leaves falling, like, is a time for the bodies to rest a little bit in the darkness, and gather up your acorns for the winter. So I think there's a lot of learning from the seasons. And by noticing, I think, one of the biggest things and the simplest thing is the noticing, and I think it's the danger of the busyness. I try to resist the busyness, but the danger of the busyness is the not noticing, not paying attention to what's going on. As you say, the external is internal. That's, you can't really differentiate the two. They're not separate. So by paying attention, then we can understand sometimes what the body's trying to tell us and actually listen, which I don't always do, but
I love that. When you say that, it makes me think of dreams, because I always see dreams as paintings, of these subconscious somatic states that we're not even feeling, but we get to sensationally live inside of for a moment. And that's how I experience land and this changing season. This just like you were saying, there's this externalization of what's internal. as the sap in the trees start going down and conserving themselves from the leaves, I feel the sap in me going into my core, instead of being flowing and sweating as I would in the summertime. So there's this real congruency with the land, which again speaks to there's more people in the world than just humans. There's so many different persons out there, like tree people and rock people and leaf people. And so just to be with them in my body is so uniting and connective. I just love it. We have to stop. This is I could easily talk to you two for a while, and I would love to come visit. I really want to come visit next year. I would love to find a way. Yeah, let's make that happen. I want to go into the water with you. I just want to be re-baptized.
Yeah, well, you're always welcome.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
What do you want people to know here about how to find your work if they're interested? Like, where should they go? Why don't you let us know about that?
Sure. Yeah, indigenous.ie is our URL. It's got a couple of different pages on it. One of it is referenced in the conference next year called Jangan 23. So that'll give. It's still under development, that page, but there's the basics there of the date, and we'll get that developed fairly soon. And we're beginning to focus on that. And otherwise, you can read around a wee bit. We've got a slightly more commercialized page where we're beginning to try and work around breathing, cold water, nutrition, and all as a pay for thing. Or one of them, and connecting with some of my work that I do in the adventure company. So it's a bit of a rolling feast, but that's a good starting point. It allows people to declare as Indigenous of this land, and it's a moving feast. So
yeah, and I think it's important to say too, the Indigenous work it's not for profit. So I think that anything that's done on that under that heading is just really just covers its own cost. If you know what I mean, so nobody's making any money out of it, or it's not a thing to be sort of marketed as such.
Yeah. I so appreciate you two as humans and as more than humans, and as just this work you do. It's so beautiful, and it's nice for me to have people I can connect to that can nurture me in my Irish roots in a way that was lost. So I'm second, third generation, right? So it's like I love to look in my lineage to see when did we leave the motherland. And then each generation, what did we forget and what did we remember? And so I'm in my trying to remember as much as I can right now. So I will definitely be leaning on you two and other people you put me toward in the coming years for that.
Oh,
thank you for giving us the space and time to be together with you and connect right across the world.
And your wisdom as well. Like some beautiful things were taken away.
Provides great context for us to interact with. So we'll hopefully hear more of your story as well at some stage when appropriate. So.
Yeah, more soon for sure. Okay, you too. Thank you so much.
Slán go fáil.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
That's the end of today's episode. Now let's take a moment to notice where we feel the episode in our bodies. Close your eyes. Take a breath. And let whatever wants to come up, come up. And remember, those sensations hold the wisdom that we're looking for. If you want to go deeper, visit holisticlifenavigation.com.